Well, good morning, everybody. I think when we get to 50 plus, that's pretty good for everybody who's going to be fashionably late. So we'll kick off. Welcome to the CyberSmart webinar with the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, DSIT. My name's Dennis Palmer. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of CyberSmart, and it's our pleasure to host the event for you all on a topic that is of real interest, both operationally and for business purposes, to all of us on the call. Following on from CyberSmart Live about 3 weeks ago, we're excited to welcome back Gemma Robson, the policy advisor from DSIT, who did the presentation at that time, Philip Urbaniak, who the senior policy advisor for cyber at DSIT, and Stuart Peters, the head of cyber resilience. And this morning, they'll be taking us through the proposed legislative changes for digital service providers, including measures to bring managed service providers into the UK's Network and Information Systems NIS legislation and regulation. We'll look at the implications of these changes, what they will have, the scope, and the steps that we can take before the changes officially take place. During CyberSmart Live, we captured a number of questions asked by the audience, and some of those we will address today. You'll also have the opportunity to ask any questions, and if you wish to ask questions, please use the Q&A button that you should all be able to find on screen and put your questions in there. The session is being recorded, and we'll make the session available to everybody post the event. After the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, which will take up the majority of the time that we have today. During that period, we will pitch all of the questions back to DSIT and look for responses. After the event, we'll collate all of the questions and all of the answers, and we'll follow that up in a supplementary document at the end of the presentation. Feel free to leave cameras and things on. Please mute yourselves if at all possible. The session is being recorded, and away we go. So without further ado, over to the DSIT team for their introductions and their presentations.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dennis, and good morning, everyone. So just briefly, my name is Philip Urbaniak. I work for the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, formerly known as DCMS. And I lead the Digital Service Providers team, which, among other things, focuses on the legislative changes for digital service providers. And here we also mean managed service providers, so hopefully of interest to you. Today I'm joined as well by Gemma, who all of you hopefully know from 2 weeks ago. Gemma, would you like to say hi briefly?
Yeah, for those of you who don't know me, I was the presenter on the, what's it called, the showcase last month, and I work really closely with Philip, so I'm a policy advisor working on the legislative proposals.
Great, thank you. And we also have Stuart with us. Stuart?
Hi, yeah, I'm Stuart Peters. I'm head of the cyber resilience team. We're basically responsible within DSIT for looking at cyber regulation across the economy and have responsibility for oversight of the NIS regulations.
Brilliant. Also, I'm conscious that we have people with us who didn't see Gemma's presentation last month. So we thought we'd just quickly recap on the proposed changes to NIS and kind of look at how they will impact managed service providers on the ground. So moving on to the next slide, while I won't really be explaining how our MSP work came about, at every occasion, we sort of iterate what we're trying to achieve, and that kind of usually helps inform the discussion. So in this case, in the case of MSPs, what we're trying to do is kind of mitigate against specifically 2 risks. And in the first scenario, maybe I'll just explain it by using an example. So let's assume I'm DSIT, so I'm Department for Science, and I'm relying on an MSP to do work. And so I'm using a number of managed services. And so when the managed service fails, I also fail because I can't, for example, do work anymore. And in the second scenario, the second type of risk we're trying to mitigate against is the scenario when I'm still DSIT, but for example, my managed service providers get breached. And even though I could potentially still do work, and still kind of continue, operations of my own organization, an attacker who kind of breached that MSP also gets access to, for example, my networks and potentially the networks of other MSP customers. So that kind of introduces that at-scale risk. And once they have access to my networks, potentially at some point, they can either steal my data or, for example, disrupt my functions. So these are the kind of two specific risks we're trying to mitigate against. And moving on to the next slide, in terms of what we are proposing, the main change impacting managed service providers is really the proposal to bring them into the scope of the NIS regulations. So we're bringing managed service providers, managed services into, and we have sort of set out what we mean by managed services in the consultation and the consultation response, but I will just briefly outline what we mean by this term managed services, and happy to have a discussion later as well about kind of the details of the definition. But just briefly, by managed service, we mean a service that is provided by a third party. So here, the key thing is basically it's not supplied in-house. That service is related to the provision of IT services. So here we mean things like systems, infrastructure, networks, or security. And that service also provides regular and ongoing management, support, and active administration or monitoring of all of those IT systems, IT infrastructures, IT networks, or their security. Also potentially briefly worth flagging that it's not a one-off service. So it's this ongoing element is kind of key here. And it's also done on kind of customers' behalf, as opposed to, as some previously asked, what's the difference with software vendors? Basically, software vendors update their products on a regular basis, but leave it for customers to action updates. And in this case, MSPs do it for their customers. So moving away from the definition, when we propose, in terms of this proposal, when we refer to managed services, we actually mean or refer to all of the managed services operating in the UK. So we're not just talking about those services that are supplied to, for example, UK government or UK critical national infrastructure, but operating across all of the UK. And you can see that there's also two more proposals, two more boxes on this slide, because these are also other two legislative changes that will impact managed services that I think are worth noting. And so just briefly, the second one is around establishing a risk-based approach to regulating digital services. And obviously, when we bring in managed services, it will also kind of impact managed service providers. And at the moment, ICO, the regulator who oversees digital services, oversees those services in what we call kind of a reactive way. So basically, ICO come in after, for example, an incident takes place and they do an investigation, but they aren't really approaching digital service providers proactively. They're not asking for evidence of how they are following NIS. It's more of a kind of a light touch reactive manner. So what we're trying to propose is we'll adjust this approach slightly, and we will establish that the ICO can supervise the DSPs more proactively. And so this should be, by the way, done on the basis of risk. In reality, it'll only kind of affect those DSPs that ICO assess to have kind of the highest risk. So for example, we assume or predict that these will be either the biggest companies, the biggest DSPs operating in the market, or those that potentially have a really big exposure to UK CNI or have an importance or are critical to national security. But it's really unlikely to impact a great majority of digital services. And so I assume that it will have a very low impact on this audience here today as well. And so what that means for the rest of the industry is that they will kind of continue to be overseen under the light touch regime, as is more or less the case at the moment. And the third box there that you can see on the right side of the slide is relates to small providers. So currently, small and micro enterprises are exempt from NIS. We intend to apply that to MSPs as well. So what that means is that if you employ, for example, less than 50 people, or have a turnover of less than 10 million euros a year, you will not be in scope of NIS regulations. However, a point to note is that we're proposing a slight change, an additional power to allow ICOs to designate small and micro DSPs only in very exceptional circumstances. Again, this is linked to risks. Again, this will unlikely impact on the audience here, but we thought it's worth being aware of. And moving on to the last slide, you'll be pleased to hear, I will just briefly read out what these changes will mean on the ground for the industry. So as you can see on the slide, there will be duties placed on you. You'll have to register with the ICO. You'll have to take steps to secure your networks and information systems. You'll have to work on minimizing the impacts of incidents on your networks and information systems. And you'll be reporting relevant incidents to the ICO. And one more thing to flag is that ICO will kind of issue further regulatory guidance. It will likely be based on the widely supported cyber assessment framework for that will be kind of targeted at managed services and other DSPs. And that will hopefully help clarify what's expected of industry in terms of meeting NIS requirements. I might be getting a little bit detailed here, but there's also thinking around potentially creating this so-called CAF overlay. But basically, this will kind of involve a type of guidance that will help provide indications of how those outcomes or indicators of good practice could be met by the industry. So hopefully we'll provide a lot of clarity for how those requirements could be met. And really, this is pretty much everything from me at this point, and we will be happy to take your questions now. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you, Philip. There's two immediate questions that have come straight up. The first one from Joseph Pinder. What's the full scope of managed service providers, i.e. or e.g. if we subcontract to an NOC or a SOC provider, are they in scope?
So I have three colleagues on the call. I'll try and kind of share those questions equally. I wonder, Gemma, would you be okay to take this one?
Sorry, I have some issues in my throat this morning. Yes, so it's worth looking at the definition that we set out in the consultation response, which we can share the link if it's not been shared. But my initial reaction, and obviously we'd have to, I'm not sure if there was a specific point where you were worried they weren't in scope, but our intention would be for most SOC and to be in scope. So my initial reaction is, yes, they probably would be in scope, but you'd need to look at the definition, or at least the characteristics that we set out, because they'll only be, and also, of course, if they're small and micro, they wouldn't be in scope. I don't know if that answers your question, or if there was a specific concern there. I can see Stuart's got his hand up.
Yeah, just to come at it from a different angle. So if you're an MSP and you subcontract your services to a NOC or a SOC, then you as an MSP are responsible for your supply chain and your contract things. If you supply it to if they're doing something as services on behalf of you, they would not automatically be in scope unless they met the definitions of an MSP themselves. You as the MSP are the one who are in scope, and your people that you contract to do your services are only in scope if they themselves meet the definition of a MSP. Otherwise, you're responsible for their activities through your contractual basis, I think.
So effectively, we're saying, Stuart, that there's an element of due diligence where you've done subcontracting in order to provide those services as an MSP.
Yes, and I would assume in such instances, you as the person doing the subcontracting would be held responsible anyway for the performance of the subcontracted entity.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next question, which came from Gordon Sayers. Reference a point that was made during the presentation. The majority of MSPs in the UK are less than 50 users or 10 million euros under the regulation. Do you see this as a concern? And it's a supplementary question that came out during the conversation 3 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago, when we did CyberSmart Live, which effectively is, can you voluntarily opt in if you're not in scope of the regulation? Much like you would do, for instance, under the DPO regulations with the ICO, where you have mandatory DPO and you can voluntarily nominate yourself and register as for DPOs, etc.
Right, thank you. So I'll come in first, and then maybe others will join as well. But just briefly to say, we come from the Department for Innovation as well. So the government is really supportive of the innovation and fostering innovation across the economy, and is really hesitant on putting on the burdens on especially the small and micro enterprises. We are aware and are trying to balance the risks of potentially putting undue burdens on the small and micro enterprises versus actually addressing the security, the relevant security concerns. And that's really why we are proposing that exemption from the exemption, or we're basically proposing that power for the regulator to be able to designate a certain small or micro digital service providers in recognition that actually some of these smaller companies can also bring a pretty big strategic risk to the UK resilience. So it's a balancing act. We also have to recognize the kind of broader industry kind of concerns that kind of also came through the government consultation last year. And so we feel that power to designate certain exceptionally critical small and micro at the moment is the right balance to strike. But definitely appreciate the point there. And in terms of the voluntary opt-in, I must admit, we haven't discussed this with the regulator yet, so this is something we'll definitely pick up at some point soon when we engage with them. But I'm just expecting they might be slightly hesitant because they will basically have no regulatory kind of oversight or power over those who opt in. So I don't really know what that would mean on the ground. And also, it's probably worth flagging that that guidance, that cyber assessment framework that the ICO is working on at the moment, it's going to be published on their website. So it's going to be available for everyone. And everyone, irrespective of the size, will be kind of encouraged, and this will be available for them to access and read, and will mean that if there's those that are eager to or willing to actually take up on the outcomes or follow the requirements of that framework, they will be very much welcome to do so. And there's also NCSC who advise and help the industry. And in the case of the compliance or attacks. So there's also another route to basically be consulting with NCSC on that. So I'll stop here. I'm conscious it's been a bit of a ramble, but Stuart or Gemma, anything else to add here?
Nothing specific. Oh, sorry, Gemma. I mean, there's nothing specific. I can look through. There's a lot of questions around in the chat around the small and medium enterprise exemption. So to quickly answer, yes, we're aware that the vast majority of managed service providers are probably below the 50 staff or 10 million euro turnover. We understand that in this market it might cause a risk, but we are under legal duties to try to minimize the impact on small and micro enterprises, mostly to reduce the level of regulatory burden on them. We will be monitoring the situation to see actually if there are member incidents, and if there is a genuine need to bring them into scope. At the moment, the government is particularly reluctant to impose burdens on small and micro enterprises. So we need a justifiable evidence reason to bring companies in. We also understand that actually with this market there are risks in that you'll end up with some people regulated, some not regulated, and differences in standards. I think all we can say is that we, as I said before, that we're looking at it. We will look at this and we will monitor this to see if there actually is, if it does cause concerns. We will speak to the ICO about whether they want to have a regulatory, a voluntary regulatory aspect. But like Philip said, the problem with that is that their legal powers specifically exclude small and micro. So we'd have to see what how a voluntary system would work in practice.
Okay. Let's move on and take another question then. Let's have a look. One of the questions that frequently comes up is understanding, and it was raised earlier on by, where are we? It was a question around what would be the exceptional circumstances. Is there any clarity around what that might mean, or is that purely down to the ICO to determine? Because it's difficult for businesses to prepare for reporting if they don't understand the criteria that they're prepared to report on.
Right, so I'll give it a go, and then Gemma could potentially come in. So in that designation of small and micro, it will be fundamentally up to the ICO to risk assess those micro and small that are either known to them or are flagged by other either businesses or competent authorities. So I don't really want to speculate on behalf of the ICO. However, we envisage this to relate to cases such as, for example, a small MSP is supplying a number of critical national infrastructure sectors, and actually a number of very kind of critical services, or there is half of the sector that relies on that really small MSP. So that really is a massive amount of risk concentrated within that one small provider. But Gemma, is there anything else you'd like to add here?
No, that's exactly right. Just some reassurance that there will be a process around this in terms of written notification, appeals, representation. We're exploring a transition period, so that it won't be that just suddenly you have all these things upon you with no chance for appeal or representation. We are exploring all that and kind of making sure that that's all in place. So hopefully some reassurance there, because we're aware that we will set the ICO will set out the criteria, but it will be ultimately up to them to decide on a risk base, as Philip said, based on risk, who does and who doesn't come in, and we don't want to speak for them.
Okay. Thank you very much. Another question then around the status of MSPs and managed service providers. Most managed service providers, or certainly some of them, don't work solely in the UK. How are you going to ensure that some of the work is aligned to, say, international requirements?
Right, so international is something that we really care about, the international dimension, but also recognize that it is a complex picture. So what we're doing is we're talking with a number of strategic partners on kind of scoping ways we can join up our policies and streamline requirements. It's not always possible, but we can flag that EU have, as part of their NIS 2 updates, also proposed to bring in managed service providers into the scope of the legislation. So there's a massive alignment here with the EU, and there are other countries such as the US, Israel, and Singapore kind of looking into this space more and more actively. And so we're kind of in touch with them and kind of trying to inform the work that they do as much as possible, because we do recognize that this is an issue that crosses borders and doesn't necessarily kind of relate to just one jurisdiction. I think I'll pause here.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question that came up from a number of people is, what's the timeline that we're looking at here for the next steps, the transition period, if there's going to be a transition period, once the regulations are introduced?
All right, should I nominate Stuart or Gemma?
Okay, so the first timetable is we're aiming to get legislation to come in hopefully to enter Parliament at the end of this year, and it will come into effect next year, and then there will be, it's not determined yet, but that we will set a period of time in order for companies to come within the scope and have to register. When we did the original NIS regulations, companies were given 3 months from the time of it coming into effect to them at least registering, because that did not mean that they were automatically had to meet all the requirements of the regulations. They just had to register, and then the ICO will work with industry to set a timeline in which companies are to comply with the general elements of the regulations, because the regulations work in such a way that there's a general power within the actual NIS regulations, but the ICO is the one who sets out the guidance and determines exactly what companies have to do, what their security requirements, etc. they have to meet, and it's the ICO that's responsible for overseeing that. So at the moment, our best guess at the moment is we would get legislation in the middle of next year. Companies would be expected to register in the second half of next year, and then start meeting the requirements of the actual the security requirements. I think towards the end of next year.
Okay, thank you for that. There's an interesting point that a number of people have now raised on the Q&A, that looking at the definitions and looking at critical reporting that has to be done, it would potentially exempt a significant amount of the MSP businesses within the UK. As there seems to be a general feeling that may well be the case. However, let's move on and ask some more questions then. How do these legislative changes link to things like Cyber Essentials? And I will declare our hand in this. We are a certification body for Cyber Essentials, and I'm not touting for business, and I'm not touting for the government to endorse any product. But should managed service providers be preparing to come under things like NIS regulations, be using things like the Cyber Essentials scheme, or the other things like ISO 27000 or some of those other certification schemes, in order to prepare themselves? And would those sort of things be sufficient to cover the scope, or is much more required?
All right, I'll give it a go first. The short answer is yes, they should be following Cyber Essentials and any other standards if possible. We do encourage this very much, but we see it only as the first good step towards kind of achieving the compliance with the NIS legislation. Cyber Essentials itself is not enough to cover all of the requirements of NIS, although given that the very specific regulatory guidance isn't published yet by the regulator, I'm not going to speculate on what those specific requirements will be. However, the CAF, so the cyber assessment framework that the regulator is currently kind of exploring as the basis of the guidance, is much more substantial than Cyber Essentials. What we are also thinking of doing, and no promises in that space yet, but we're thinking of trying to map various standards against the cyber assessment framework, so as to make it easy for the industry to show how one may evidence, for example, if they comply with ISO 27000 or Cyber Essentials, an extent to which actually having those in place can then be used as evidence of showing the compliance with, let's say, an aspect or an extent of CAF. So this is something that we definitely recognize the industry would potentially be interested in. But in terms of the very question itself, we encourage Cyber Essentials, but no, it's not enough.
Okay, thank you for that. A couple of people have asked a question, and I'm going to try and summarize it and try and bring it together. A number of MSPs work with organizations such as the MOD or the NHS. How do they understand, and how will they be able to know whether they're going to be affected and mandated to as part of, say, CNI or critical service provisions? How are they going to understand whether they're in or out of the scope of the regulation?
Right. So I think the usual thresholds apply if this MSP that is supplying to the Ministry of Defense or NHS has a turnover, they have a turnover less than 10 million euros or 50 people, they are out of the scope of the legislation. But it is possible that they provide services across, I don't know, a large swath of MOD or NHS, and then they are identified as that exceptionally, critical supplier. And then a relevant competent authority will talk to the ICO, flag this to the ICO that, look, we have that one MSP that half of the sector relies on. And it will be then up to the ICO to risk assess that statement and decide whether that small MSP will be included into the scope of the legislation. And if ICO will decide positively to include them, that a very MSP will be notified of it. Other than that, even though you're supplying to the government and critical sectors but are not meeting the thresholds, you are still out of scope of this legislation.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question that's been asked relates to broadly to the scope of the regulation. The work is focusing on managed service and managed services and their delivery, but there's a lot of risks that are linked directly to software and versions and patching and updating, etc. Is there any plan to incorporate all of this type of thing into this type of regulation?
This is potentially a very broad and nuanced question with lots of aspects here. I'm not sure if in this scenario or in this question we are talking about an MSP that relies on a software vendor or uses software, or
no, I'm thinking more along the lines of an MSP that's delivering service, is managing service provision for an organization.
Well, then, as long as it's appropriate and proportionate for that managed service provider to be patching, if it's, for example, if in that context we're talking about the software that they own or oversee, yes, they will have to do all of these things. But if they're using the let's say the software of another company in another scenario, then they will be required to update or implement the patches that are available. But if there is a vulnerability within that very software that hasn't been caused by them, then it won't be their responsibility. More broadly, though, on the software kind of side of question, we just closed our team just ran the government consultation on software resilience. So the broader software issue, which we recognize is very much overlapping and relevant for MSPs and other digital service providers, we're now trying to better understand and scope in terms of what the biggest issues, what the biggest priorities should be. And the team is currently digesting the responses to the consultation and is planning to issue the official government response in the next couple of months. So this is a space definitely to watch. Don't know if others would like to come in and add anything.
No, I guess just that we can share the link to the consultation. Unfortunately, it has closed, but yes, software, this issue is definitely the team's aware and is doing a whole separate work stream to analyse what the best policy response would be. And so it's worth having a read of that consultation, and we can share the link. And I'm sure if you have thoughts, even though the consultation is closed, the team would be happy to speak with you.
And just to add a point on there, we are actually speaking with that team. Thank you to Gemma who introduced us, and we will be planning a webinar with them, I believe around September time, when the results are shared. So we have got something penciled in the diary for when that is made available to everyone.
Okay, next question I've got then is around, it's a business concern. Has the government considered the challenge for out-of-scope MSPs to potentially lose customers on the basis of them not being required to register with the ICO?
Yeah, I'll come in on that one. Yes, we are aware, and we have thought about that, and it's part of what we are discussing with the ICO. I think it's important here to just bring it back to note that the government's aim in this is not to address every single risk for every single company within the UK. We're very much looking at it as from a systemic point. How can we reduce systemic risk within the UK? How can we avoid major incidents that affect large proportions of the economy and have a major societal impact, and how can we reduce the risks to critical infrastructure and government services? The approach that we've taken about not including small and micro is not just an approach done in the UK, it's also the approach within the EU, and it's a broad approach. So we're not trying, at the moment, there is not an intention to include every single MSP or every single digital service provider within the UK in the scope of these regulations. It is intended to be for the largest ones that can cause the most systemic risk or damage across the UK economy. So we're not. So that the bit there around causing potentially business challenges for businesses if they're not registered. So we are aware of that, but at the moment we don't think it's appropriate to place a legislative burden on all managed service providers. We're only looking at the larger, the main, and the bigger players, because we assess that they're the ones who can cause the most systemic risk. We are willing to look at it in the future, I think, but as I said before, the barriers to that will be quite high, the political barriers, because there is a strong desire not to place burden on small businesses. It would also put us at odds to legislation within the EU, etc., and it would need quite a large amount of evidence. When it's with things like registered or not registered, I think if the vast majority or a large proportion of UK MSPs are below the line, then a large proportion will not be registered. We will look with the ICO to see if there is a way in which we can have voluntary regulations and saying that you can do it. But at the moment, to put it slightly harshly, we don't want to bring everybody in, and we understand that might cause barriers to smaller companies. We're also monitoring to make sure that larger companies don't use it to their own advantage and as well. So it's a case of we will monitor it, and if it becomes an issue and that is causing significant problems or distorting the market, then we will take action.
Okay. Because I could see the circumstances where it becomes that badge of honor on an MSP site to say we are registered, which becomes a barrier to trade for other MSPs, and that would be a very difficult position for a lot of businesses in the UK to sustain and to support their businesses.
Yeah, I can understand that. I can see that. it has to be said that we haven't seen that yet in the cloud market, who have been within scope of the regulations and have had this exemption for the last 4 years. So we haven't yet seen it, but if there is evidence that it is happening and that larger players within scope are being treated advantageously because they're in and small ones are not, then yeah, we would look at this again and take action.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm out of questions that I had for this conversation. Are there any other questions from the audience, please? Final one there then from Gary Smith. And thank you. We're no longer members of the EU. We need to set a precedent. We need to set a precedent, and as a nation, we really need to take the lead here. So,
yeah,
we go. I'll read that one whichever way.
I completely understand that, but the fact is that we, as a country, do not want to place burdens unnecessarily on our small and micro enterprises, and we need justification in order to do so. So regardless of what's happening within the EU at the moment, we assess that actually this regulatory burden is not one that we want to place on our small and micro enterprises.
Also, it's probably just worth flagging that we obviously meet with various types of audiences, and some representatives of the small and micro digital service providers or managed service providers are more willing to be in scope of the legislation. Some don't. We were also previously in talks with the Federation of Small Businesses, who have a slightly more nuanced view when it comes to being willing to bring all of the small and micro enterprises into the scope of legislation. So we also kind of need to balance the views of the broader industry as well, alongside all of the factors that Stuart already referred to. I'm just wondering, Dennis, if people don't have any more questions, if we can just pose a quick question to the audience, would that be okay?
You can, please.
So just from a kind of an awareness point of view, I was just curious if people on the call here are aware that the NCSC, so National Cybersecurity Center, can provide you with support in case of an attack. I was just curious if people are aware of this potential available support, and if so, curious to know if you have ever reached out to them. You can just type in the chat your responses. Will be helpful to gauge quickly. So there's a mixture of replies. Interesting.
Yeah, interesting. There is a nice broad mixture of responses there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad I asked the question then.
Thanks, Philip. Well, thank you everybody for attending today. I hope you have, as I have, learned more about NIS and gained some clarity from some of the questions on the Q&A session. Thank you for all the comments and the questions. We will collate them and publish them as a summary as soon as possible. We will be publishing a recording of the webinar, and it will be available to all attendees, so look out for that and the link to it in your email boxes coming up shortly. Finally, thank you to Gemma, Stuart and Philip and DSIT for leaning into the webinar. It's a very welcome opportunity. We get very few opportunities to meet central government who are planning all of these things. So thank you for taking the time out of your days to come and speak directly to people who are going to be impacted by the legislation and the regulation coming our way. And finally, thank you to Vicky for helping pull this up together. We will be following up with some further webinars. As Vicky said, we'll be looking at webinars around the implications of the software consultation that's coming up in due course. And CyberSmart will be running some further webinars around regulatory changes, Cyber Essentials Plus, and all of the other regulatory schemes that are out there to support MSPs and businesses across the UK. Thank you all for your time. We look forward to seeing you at future Cyber Smart webinars. Thank you very much to DSIT, and we'll speak to you all soon. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.